Bridge on the River Kwai was a Hollywood epic starring Alec Guinness about the British prisoners of war enslaved by the Japanese to build the Burma Railway. The film was based on a novel by a man who'd never been there about a British officer who never existed. And according to the real survivors of the Kwai, the result was a travesty of the truth, which needs to be set straight.
Kelly.
Good Lord.
Ian McIntyre. I love to see you.
How are you?
I'm very lovely. How are you?
And you had a moustache.
These men are veterans of the Second World War, survivors of Japan's imperial dream to create an empire in Asia.
Have you seen many people?
I've seen one or two.
He said 2 field officers of the British Army sitting on the steps of a brothel, waiting the pleasure of a barbarian. I swear that's what he said.
Man, you wouldn't have had Tom's job. He had to operate the radio. All I had to do was steal the bloody batteries.
Now, in happier times, they meet again to mark a war crime whose atrocities they are determined shall never be forgotten. When Singapore surrendered in February 1942, the victorious Imperial Japanese Army rounded up 61,000 Allied prisoners of war. Half of those captured were British. They were moved north from Singapore to work as slave labor building the railway through the jungle connecting Bangkok to Rangoon. From there, the Japanese would mount the conquest of India. Each of the 270 miles was to exact a terrible price. 13,000 died. Thousands more had their health ruined for life. That price is still being paid by the survivors. The experience of those 3.5 years' captivity has left scars on body and mind. The survivors are still victims. The 13,000 who failed to return died of malnutrition, brutality, and disease. Of the diseases, the most relentless killers were malaria, dysentery, and cholera. But just as lethal was the railway itself.
You had to travel sometimes several miles to the railway embankment that was being built and then back again. People started before dawn and came back after dark. And for 12 hours or so, they were in a tropical sun. So the combination of being sick, having malnutrition, and working was what killed you.
In the early days, people were dying every day, 10, 12, 15 people. And of course, they had to be cremated because cholera spread by water, so we had to cremate them. And this meant putting them on bamboo fires. Well, the noise of the exploding bamboos was one thing, but the traumatic side was that the bodies appeared to come to life in that presumably the fluids inside the body became steam and they started writhing around and the vocal cords were disturbed and they made groaning noises as if they were still alive. And this had a terrible effect on us.
They jerk up and down, the arms would jerk up, the legs. When the heat got to the sinews, yes, the legs, and they'd sit up, some of them. I know the chap who was in charge of it, named a corporal, I won't mention his name, he went mad. That was his job. He was out the way of the Japs, and they never come near him because they were frightened of the cholera, so they left him alone, as long as he burnt them. And he got extra rice, and he was happy, but it turned his mind.
Terrible thing happened to me with the cholera epidemic. During the cholera epidemic, I was leaning over somebody who had just arrived and asking him a few questions, and they talked very softly. So I was leaning well over his face, and he suddenly vomited, like a sort of whale spouting, straight into my mouth. And it's amazing how I didn't want to appear as repulsed as I was by this incident. So I closed my mouth, just a minute, and I went off. I spat all day. I couldn't swallow, as if I had ligature around my neck. I didn't swallow, I think, for 24 hours.
Well, the camp I was in, there was 95% dead in 3 months. out of 1,680, there was 1,400 dead in 3 months.
Sick and debilitated though they were, these men still had to provide the workforce. Progress on the railway had to meet the punishing schedules set by the Japanese engineers. Inadequate rations caused widespread and severe malnutrition, and the Japanese guards used any brutality to impel the prisoners to work faster.
If the war was going bad for the Japanese, it was what we called a hate day, be on your mettle. And I was in the hut, what they call the death hut, from which you didn't return. And it was a hate day in so much as the Japanese hadn't got the full strength on parade for a work detail and ordered the men to go into the death hut and bring out the sick men. No, I couldn't walk, I couldn't be carried, I had to be carried. And because I had to be carried, I couldn't stand up. They tried to prop me up and they separated the men from each side of me. And I fell flat on the floor. And that's when they put the rifle butt straight into my testicles. And that's why my wife and I have no children.
Well, I was caught what they call having a yasmi. That's rest in Japanese, which I was. And this Japanese spotted me. He was up on the girders on the bridge and he called me up. And my mate said, "You're in for it, it's the Frog." That was the nickname he had, a really vicious man. He was known as a vicious man. So I had to climb up, and I knew what he was going to do when I got there. He had a big piece of bamboo. So when I got about 3 foot off him, he started with the bamboo. So what I did, I locked my arm round it, round one log, and I wouldn't let go. And he did his best to knock. He was trying to kill me, knock me off. Anyway, I wouldn't let go. There was only one way I'd have let go. He'd have had to chop that arm off. And when he did stop, I couldn't move. That arm was numb. And 3 or 4 chaps had to come up and get me down. But 2 days later, we had the great pleasure of seeing him fall off. The same spot he tried to knock me down, he fell off and he was killed. And you'd have thought he was Liverpool scoring a goal when he hit the bottom.
There was a little Geordie fellow on the right-hand side of me, and these 2 Japs were giving a right going over, and I just went and stood in front of him and said, "Enough's enough." He was bleeding all over, and suddenly they started on me, and they knocked me out, and I finished up in a foxhole. Difficult to talk about foxhole. It's about 3 foot wide at its surface, ground surface, and about 4 foot deep. About 9 inches wide at the bottom. And they put you in that, you're on the ball of your feet, and your head's crouched down like that with the grill over the top. And they throw a rice ball into you, and they throw water into you. And I mean throw water into you to cool you, not to drink. You're supposed to take it off your shoulder and lick it. The rice ball you're supposed to try and lift. You imagine a cone of earth trying to get your hand up to a rice ball that's got down behind your shoulder and bring it to your mouth. Having said that, you've got this excruciating pain and you pass out. I understand I was in there for 4 days, and it took me the best part of 12 weeks for them to straighten me out. And the Japs even then used to come into the hut and slap me, what they call pinto, because I couldn't straighten myself out to go to work. But I wasn't on my own in that. Don't think that's just me. This was a daily thing. Some men were far worse than me. Some men were crucified. Actually crucified to trees with nails through their hands. Men were hung upside down by their ankles. Men were made to hold 2 4-gallon tins of water with a wire handle till the wire cut through the flesh into the bone and their hands were bleeding. With a bayonet at the back, they attempted to drop those tins, till eventually they did collapse, and all the prodding with a bayonet couldn't bring them back to consciousness. These are what we call everyday occurrences in the camps. When these men came home, the doctors who first examined them in 1945 were saying, "Right, cough, check here, that, yes, you're okay, go home." They had no idea that 3.5 years of deprivation, the injury it had done not only to the nerves but to the organs, and this is only just coming to light. It seems so bloody hopeless trying to convince the doctors and the government today of what those men went through. You know, I really mean this. We've even got stupid people today who turn around and say, well, what you've got's wrong with you is only what one could expect for a man of your age.
Now, those survivors are being screened for the diseases that are coming to light after 40 years in 12 selected hospitals around the country.
Thanks very much. See you in a minute.
Dr. Dion Bell of the Tropical Hospital in Liverpool has studied the long-term effects of their captivity on the survivors.
When they first came back, one of the important things they suffered from was cirrhosis of the liver. I'm sure that accounted for a lot of the excess mortality in the early years. Another important infection was tuberculosis, which caused a lot of deaths in the early years, and of course a lot of chronic disease and sometimes damage to the lungs, which is still causing men to have symptoms.
Well, it seems a bit of 35 years with nothing at all, and then you find wounds, and I've had them all a while, and loose bowels for 40 years.
Yes, quite, I agree with you. You've got to remember that these men were 3.5 years in a state where they had virtually permanent diarrhea from either amoebic dysentery or other sorts of dysentery, and it's not surprising that this damaged the gut in some way.
As a result of recent investigations, these men now have a chance to gain compensation. Dr. Bell and his colleagues estimate that at least 2,000 survivors are still suffering from a disease which is a potential killer, a worm infestation called strongyloides.
It lurks in the soil in the form of a little larva, waiting for a chance. And when a human skin is in contact with the soil, the larva penetrates it. And then they go on a long safari around the body, and when they're doing that, they may cause symptoms. If you have something which reduces the immunity, such as a severe disease of some sort or another, or you give the patient large doses of cortisone, or the patient has a renal transplant, for example, all of these things upset the immune system. And when the larvae are migrating through the body then, they take with them germs which can infect parts of the body, such as the brain, and the coverings of the brain, to cause meningitis, to infect the abdominal cavity, giving peritonitis, and infecting the bloodstream, giving a septicemia. So when that happens, the patient's condition becomes dire. And there have been a few ex-Far East prisoners who we know of who have died of this overwhelming form of the infection.
It's good to see you again, Mr. Heyman.
One of those in danger is Joe Heyman. His worm infestation has flared up since treatment for 2 recent heart attacks.
You think you've got the strongyloides worm infection?
I'm pretty sure I have, yes.
Can you tell me what your symptoms have been?
Well, it starts maybe up here, and like a big welt, red rash, very itching, and works its way right down, sometimes right down to the feet.
How long have you had it now, just looking back over the years?
Oh, I should say 30 years now.
Doctor and patient face a cruel choice.
Now, if we get rid of the worms with treatment, and when you go for your medical board, you say, well, I've had the treatment and the worms are no longer bothering me, they won't give you a pension.
I see.
Because they don't give you a pension for what happened in the past. They give you a pension for what you're suffering now, you see.
That's right, yeah.
But if we decide between us that there's a slight risk of treatment because of your past history of 2 heart attacks,
yes,
the treatment might upset you and it might present a small risk to you,
yes,
and we decide not to treat it and you decide to put up with the worms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if that happened, then clearly you'd continue to suffer from the worms, and if we could prove that you've got it, then there's no doubt you'd get a war pension for it.
Yes.
There are at least 2,000 like Joe, facing the same invidious choice. A dangerous cure, which would mean loss of pension rights, or suffer the disease for life.
I do look on this as a 40-year bonus compared to thousands of my friends that are still out there. I never had any chance of coming back. The way they treat their ex-servicemen is wrong compared to America, Australia, Canada, who were in our theatre of war. They were treated much better than us when they came back, and are still being treated better.
FIPO is the Far Eastern Prisoner of War Association. Since the war, this small, determined group has fought an uphill struggle to win war pensions. Steve Cairns is National Welfare Officer.
Successive governments have virtually turned a cold shoulder to our applications. But with the help of senior tropical doctors and psychiatrists and neurologists, we're now getting a success rate of something in the order of about 3 to 1, either an award or a war pension, of varying percentage.
There's no doubt that many have had their lives shortened by the lethal effects of the diseases I've mentioned, particularly perhaps the tuberculosis, the cirrhosis of the liver that developed early on. But many of them have had their lives changed in a much more insidious way, and that's because of the effects on their mental health that this imprisonment has had.
I couldn't talk of it. It was a part of my life I tried to put behind me. I joined no Far Eastern prisoner of war associations. I think I just tried to say I was lucky to be home and to leave it there, but I was plagued by nightmares almost every night, and particularly it was always I was back in the cremation area.
I used to dream a bit about being a POW. In POW camps, which totally unlike any ones that I had ever been in, very interesting. You know, many more bars and fences. We never had any fences. The jungle was our fence. But there's this feeling of suffocation by loss of liberty would occasionally come up.
The fear did carry on for quite a long time. I think my work helped to eliminate some of it, but at home I found it very, very difficult to go around and appear to be a normal person. For instance, if I came out of the front door of the house, I would stop in the doorway and look to the left and look to the right to see if there was a guard or somebody like that coming. And it took me a very long time to get over this hesitancy, this worry that there was the sword would fall on me one of these days.
For the first 10 years, I was bitchy, I was moody, I had fits of depression where I'd go out and I'd walk for hours and come back, and she would very quietly not say anything. She never argued with me, and I remember one dreadful night waking up with my hands round her throat. And it frightened me so much that the following day I went back to the tropical hospital, you know, and I saw the psychiatrist there.
That psychiatrist was Dr. Kamaluddin Khan. More than half the survivors he has examined have required treatment for their mental condition.
It is a sense of failure, a feeling of being miserable, sad, despondent, an occasional feeling of guilt. But the most significant thing is that of their crying spells. And I would best describe their crying spell as that of emotional incontinence. One day, while talking about something very trivial, will suddenly burst into tears as if they can't control, and they don't seem to have any control over their emotion, and they will sob almost without any control. I must say, though, that in spite of all this, I think since it has been too late, it has taken a long time for some of them to respond to treatment, and in many cases, in spite of treatment, the response is not all that satisfactory.
They're a great nation now. Not to me, they're not. I hate them. But they're a very industrious people, and they're leaving us far behind. I think they won the war. We lost it. It looks that way to me.
The scars, I don't think, will ever heal. And I find it almost impossible to meet up with Japanese of my own age. There was a situation just a few days ago, and I couldn't meet and talk to this man because he looked in exactly the same manner as these impassive people who were ruling us at that time.
I resent many things, of course, that all the people who died, and the fact that it was nearly a year before our wives knew whether we were alive after the capitulation. I resent all that. But at the same time, when I came home, I felt that we were no longer at war with them, and you will never get peace if you foster hatred. So I really, personally, have never borne any malice to them, because I wouldn't want anyone else, I wouldn't want it to happen again, and other people to go through what some of my friends went through.
I don't know, but after all that they've suffered, you'd think they'd have no trouble at all in getting some compensation. Anyway, the gun belongs to our image of America, much like hot dogs and Coca-Cola. Indeed, it's enshrined in the Constitution of the United States that all citizens have the right to bear arms, a right which is exercised by some enthusiasts with an obsessive passion for what they like to call heavy metal. In this film, Geraldo Rivera joins some American machos.
No, this isn't Lebanon, the Persian Gulf, or the Falkland Islands. This is Central Ohio, and these fellows are all private citizens. They hold jobs like teachers and engineers and salesmen. For reasons that vary from a love of weapons to a fear of foreign invasion or the collapse of law and order, groups like this one are organizing themselves in many different parts of the country.
In New Hampshire, for instance, men play at war for fun. Called the National Survival Game, players kill their rivals with paint splash.
Good boy, Tony. That was a hell of a shot.
It's not fun and games, however, in the Ozark Mountains. This is the opposite extreme. Armed to the teeth with heavy assault-type weapons, the Zarathits, a religious cult, is deadly serious about training for the end of the world.
It is our responsibility as Christians to survive the coming hard times. Amen?
Amen.
Back in the mainstream in Central Ohio, about 30 gun enthusiasts meet at least once a year to compete in a combat simulation course.
We've all done this before. Do not shoot anything that moves because there's no moving targets. There may be some movement somewhere. Don't shoot it.
As you're about to see, virtually all the weapons are automatics. That is, machine guns. And the ammunition they're using is live. The principal motivation of these fellows is recreation. War is heaven. It's fun. As many of them told me, they just like shooting holes in paper targets. But as one of them, an Air Force reservist, admitted, they do share a common political philosophy.
Yeah, we hate communists. We hate communism, what it stands for. I think that's probably our main motivation if it came right down to that. Probably one of the most anti-gun groups in this country is the American Communist Party, and it's obvious why. A well-armed populace is hard to subdue. And that's part of the reason we have a Constitution that guarantees our right to keep and bear arms. And it is probably our final vote against tyranny. And we've never had a tyranny in this country, and as long as we have an armed populace, I don't think we will.
Ironically, many of these fellows are nostalgic for the good old days of Vietnam.
It represents something that, at least for me, was a very good time of life and an enjoyable kind of existence in its way.
Military buffs, survivalists, for reasons that vary from nostalgic pleasure to political paranoia, the constitutional right to keep and bear arms is being taken to new extremes. We asked these fellows to demonstrate their firepower. Remember, they are all just plain old ordinary private citizens using their own personal weapons. An automatic, regardless of its size or the way it's used, is a machine gun, a weapon that with a single pull of the trigger will automatically keep firing, as long as it still contains bullets. It's a deadly device, because in the space of a second or two, it will fire off 30 or more shots. A semi-automatic, on the other hand, requires that the trigger be pulled for each bullet fired. According to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, there are now at least 4 times as many machine guns in the hands of private citizens, than there are in the hands of law enforcement. And that spread is rapidly getting wider. Gun enthusiasts who once bought hunting rifles or target pistols are now increasingly turning to heavy metal. They're buying machine guns, automatic weapons you don't use to go out and shoot a deer.
The only firearms that are selling are the paramilitary riot assault type weapons. They're increasing sales anywhere from 20 to 30% a year.
That trend is reflected in the magazine business. Relatively new publications such as Gung Ho, Survive, SWAT, and Gun World all thrive on advertisements for heavy weapons. The best-selling magazine, Soldier of Fortune, recently held its 3rd National Convention and Gun Show in Charlotte, North Carolina. Robert Brown, founder and publisher of Soldier of Fortune.
We've grown from 8,500 print run, or 4,400 subscribers, to close to 250,000 in 7 years. So we're reaching roughly 600,000 people a month with the magazine.
Gun shows like this one attract thousands of people in dozens of cities each and every weekend. The main attraction for those who attend these conventions is, of course, the weapons demonstration. All this sound and fury lures potential customers inside, whereas in any other trade show, salesmen peddle their products.
Well, it's for shooting bowling pins.
The retail cost on this is $434. As of to date, we are up into the $35,000 for this year.
The capstone of this convention was its closing ceremonies. 1,000 camouflage-clad conventioneers listened to speeches from General William Westmoreland and G. Gordon Liddy.
If you ever find yourself in battle, you better use everything you've got to blow the other guy away before he blows you away.
In 44 of the 50 states, it is not that difficult for an ordinary citizen to get a federal license for an automatic weapon. If you're over 21, not a felon or drug addict or mental incompetent, then the gun dealer sends your application and a set of your fingerprints to Washington. They check, and if indeed you don't have a criminal record, then after paying a $200 transfer tax, you can buy the machine gun. But if you don't want to go through the inconvenience of waiting, don't feel like paying the tax, or if you are a crook with a record, there is an easier way. There are no special restrictions on semi-automatic weapons, and converting a semi into a full automatic is frighteningly simple.
You can buy this in any gun store, basically, couldn't you?
Yeah.
It's a semi-automatic weapon. It's totally legal.
Yeah.
How hard is it to convert that into an M16, an automatic weapon?
Replace all the internal parts and about 15 minutes of machine work.
15 minutes of machine work. Another example. Today's bestseller is the Israeli-made Uzi submachine gun. With the exception of dealer samples, they are imported into this country only as semi-automatics.
May I see the Uzi? Now, this weapon at one time was a semi-automatic also.
Yeah.
Huh? It's not any longer.
Once converted, these bootleg machine guns are increasingly finding their way into criminal hands. The cops have no choice. In places like South Florida, they are going after the source.
In a continuing effort to prevent the balance of firepower from shifting from the cops to the crooks, a joint federal and local task force has been conducting raids like this one on people suspected of dealing illegal machine guns. In a recent month, they seized 700 of the illegal weapons.
For the most part, the majority of these guns were seized from what we'd classify as bootleg machine gun dealers, many of them associated with the overall narcotic trade down here.
By bootleg machine gun dealers, do you mean people who are converting semi-automatics into full automatics, or?
For the most part. The majority of these guns you see displayed here are guns that were originally, when they were sold at the retail level, were sold as pistols. And then through a minor alteration of the inner workings of the gun was converted to a machine gun.
Any recent incidents come to mind where automatics were used in criminal events?
Well, in South Florida here, over the last 2 years, they've had approximately 19 machine gun murders. There has been almost a machine gunning incident monthly down here, and many of these very brazen daylight attacks in public.
People who usually work from 9 to 5 and have been very bored have come in and wanted one of these as a security.
They feel that something is going to pop.
Well, it should be said that the stars of that film still form only a very small proportion of the population of the United States. Anyway, that's all for this program. We'll be back again next month. Till then, good night.